My name's Jose Mas. As was said, I really started in the business when I was in high school, and really grew up in this industry, building the infrastructure of a lot about what's been talked about today. And I can remember back 10, 15 years ago, the first cell phone. And for those of you that were around and remember it, it looked like a giant brick, weighed 5, 6 pounds, and nobody had it. And I remember growing up thinking, why in the world would anybody want to have a phone on them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? What could be that important? And over the last 15 years, in my wildest dreams, could I ever have imagined what communications and connectivity would do in my life and would really change how we all work and how we all function in our daily lives? You look at the internet. I got my first internet account in 1996, and I think I was an early adopter to some extent in terms of the mainstream. And if you look at all the applications that have been developed in 14 short years, because 14 years flies by, and how important the internet and the BlackBerries and the tools are in our daily lives, it's absolutely amazing. And I think that one of the challenges that all of us have in this room is, how do we envision the next 15 years? And how do we begin to apply, whether it's the businesses and the innovation behind those businesses and really the legislative efforts that we're going to make the next 15 years similar to what we've seen in the last 15 years. And we've talked a lot today about different applications, and I think that there really isn't anything I can say to add to what's already been said about to the benefits of the internet. But I do think there's a huge issue, which is the only people that are getting the internet today in a large extent, right? When we talk about rural areas and the digital divide, the reason that in urban areas everything is so popular is because the companies that are building it can make money. And the reason that in rural areas, whether it's the fact that it's not adopted or the fact that it's not there, it's a big challenge. And I think one of the things that we really need to figure out is how, as an industry, are we going to meet that? I'd like to take a step and really talk about Mostek for a second, because I think we're somewhat a personification of the American dream. And my father came to this country in 1959, came from Cuba, nothing but the shirt on his back, worked a bunch of odd-end jobs, worked as a stevedore in the ports, worked as a shoe salesman, eventually became a milkman and a successful milkman, trying to raise a family. And he had some friends that had opened up a business in Puerto Rico, building some of the first telecommunication lines, fiber lines in Puerto Rico, had opened a small branch in Miami. And it was a business that was failing and struggling. And they came to my father and they said, hey, we're about to close this business down. We'd like you to run it, and if you can turn it around, we'll give you half the business. And he had no idea what he was doing. They were building conduit and manhole systems for the telephone company at the time, which was AT&T, and generations later it's AT&T again. But he didn't know what he was doing, took the step, turned the company around. As promised, they gave him half the business. Over the course of the next 10 years, really built the business to be a leader in the South Florida market of building a lot of the fiber-based backbone that exists there today, a lot of the telecommunication lines that were being put in place. He eventually bought his partners out. In 1994, after Hurricane Andrew had come through South Florida and really ravaged a good section of our community, had gotten the contracts to really rebuild a lot of that infrastructure. In 1994, decided to take the company public. And from 1994 through about 1999, went through a very aggressive acquisition campaign, growing the business outside of the telecommunications into a lot of other infrastructure fields that we thought would grow over the years, including energy infrastructure, including cable television, satellite work, and by 1998, 1999, became the first Hispanic-owned business in U.S. history to break the $1 billion mark, which was a huge honor for our family. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1997 and wasn't able to see it, but our family's continued that legacy, and we've continued to build the business. This year we'll do roughly $2 billion, and as was said, have about 10,000 people that we employ on a day-in, day-out basis. And I think as we look at the future of both energy infrastructure, which is obviously getting a lot of attention and we think is very important, but at the same time of what we're seeing from a broadband perspective, what can't get lost is, the economy today is obviously in a lot of turmoil. And being a CEO of a public company, I see it around me every day. We're actually in a great field, infrastructure that's doing well. But everywhere we look, the economy is in distress, and there's a lot of issues. And I think different than some of the economic climates and environments that we've been in the past, we're in a much more global world today than we've ever been. We are more interconnected as people in the world than I think at any other time in history, and I think that is going to be more of a challenge as we get out of our economic issues, because we've become a nation of consumption. And I think it's been alluded to by previous speakers here today that we consume and consume and consume, but we haven't really built anything as a nation for a long time. We haven't built a lot of new industries that have survived the test of time. And I think one of the things that can't get lost in this discussion is the fact that, in doing what's right, in creating more connectivity and improving healthcare, and I think there's thousands of benefits to the internet for healthcare. I think as you look at what gaming's done, and there was examples here in the military, and today the Army, the Navy, the Marines, they're using gaming to help train their soldiers day in and day out, even before they ever get assigned to duty. When you look at elections, as has been said, I think the last presidential election changed the face of campaigns forever because of the internet. But there's still a large piece of the population that's underserved. And in that, in doing what's right, in taking them the technology and giving them the ability to excel and to grow, we'd be creating tens of thousands of jobs, probably hundreds of thousands of jobs. Today there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that strictly support the infrastructure needs of the telecommunications companies and the broadband, internet, and cable television companies in this country. Hundreds of thousands of jobs. And we talk about $7 billion in the stimulus, and we think the stimulus is fantastic. It's a huge commitment by both the administration and Congress in taking the right step forward. But, it's a drop in the bucket. It's only the beginning. In the first quarter, January, February, and March, Verizon and AT&T alone, just those two companies, spent more than the entire $7 billion in the stimulus on their networks. They spent over $8 billion on their networks in January, February, and March. Two companies. Do we really think $7 billion is going to have the impact for all of the great things that have been talked about here in the last hour and a half? Because they're real. They're real and they're tangible. And I think it's really our obligation as a nation to figure out, how do we get this in everybody's hands? And how do we invest the dollars to create the jobs that are coming from distressed industries? Our auto industry may never be the same. There's hundreds of thousands of displaced workers from that industry that need to get placed into other industries. When you look at industrial plants all across the country, they're shutting down. What are going to be the next economic engines that we create to drive the future growth of this country? I believe strongly that energy will be one. There's no reason that this country shouldn't be energy independent. We have the resources to do it, and it would create hundreds of thousands of jobs and really take us away from foreign-based oil. That's extremely important in my mind. But broadband connectivity, making us competitive in the world, I think is that much more important. Look at what India has been able to do in the last 15 or 20 years in terms of taking jobs from America. How have they done it? They've done it on education, by educating their employees not to be laborers, but to be engineers and to be call center reps, which is a great job. They've taken hundreds of thousands of jobs from this country. They've created the infrastructure in their country to support that, not necessarily countrywide, not necessarily giving it to all their citizens, but they definitely created it in a way where they made their businesses extremely competitive versus those in the United States. So I think we've fallen behind. We've allowed the large carriers, and they've done a lot. They've done a lot, but I think we all need to recognize that they're in business to make a profit, and they're going to build those areas that are going to give them the highest return. And I think we've got to help set policy that will give the incentives to both rural telephone companies, municipalities, the large carriers, to continue that broadband expansion, to continue that interconnectivity, and to really create a level playing field. Because we can talk about the cool applications that are coming, or the 26,000 applications are on the iPhone, and I'm blessed, I have access to that, but there's millions and millions of Americans that don't. It's inexcusable in the day and age that we live in. And I think that what's important to note is it's not going to happen solely by government intervention, and it's not going to happen solely by really allowing the private companies to take forward. So I think there has to be a lot more public-private partnership as we go forward and as we create the next wave of jobs. I think this is as good of an industry as any. And, you know, I applaud all of you for keeping it on the radar, because I think that, you know, to the extent that congressmen continue to see you and that it continues to get its play in the press, you know, action will come from it. But, you know, the only thing I want to add as a, you know, as a third-party industry individual, you know, we pretty much play in every technology. We're completely customer agnostic, so, you know, we really don't care who wins the battle at the end of the day. But I think the bottom line is, as you look at, you know, where we are, you know, we're headed in the right direction, but it's really only a start, and we really need to do a lot more. So I just wanted to give you those thoughts. Again, I think, you know, there's some mind-blowing numbers when, you know, I can stand here and say that I think $7 billion isn't that much money. But when you think about the task at hand, and you think about the fact that some of the larger carriers are spending that already in 3 short months, we've got a lot of work to do. Thank you.